So welcome to the third video in a sequence which outlines the Shunra product capabilities. Today we're going to be looking at Shunra network virtualization for the HP products, that's LoadRunner and Performance Center, and we're looking at the very latest version, which is our version 8.6, and it's for LoadRunner and Performance Center versions 11.5.2 and beyond. So this diagram outlines all the product capabilities from Shunra. Today we're going to be looking at the package which is available for integration into LoadRunner and Performance Center, and specifically the product Shunra NV for HP. Before we look at the capabilities, a quick outline on why this is important. So the impact of the network on performance is considerable. So here we have an example application which is tested locally, and we see that the performance for every step is within the agreed SLAs. However, when we run the same test from remote locations, we see that the user experience is considerably slower than it was before, and some steps are impacted very heavily. In some cases, these slowdowns can also cause functional failures, with the application timing out or retrying or some other failure. Of course, the impact then leads on to the load test results. And what we're looking at here is a graph from LoadRunner which shows the performance of an application as we step up virtual users. And the orange line there is stepping up users from 0 to 500 virtual users. And the graph, the lines along the bottom here, are actually showing the transaction response time of the various steps in a transaction throughout the test. And we see that overall they're quite stable and they don't vary dependent upon the number of virtual users. However, if we actually take into account the network conditions and we run the same test with the same scripts with network conditions for the remote users, we see that in fact some users have a worse performance, but that as we step up the number of virtual users, the application performance for all users is impacted, and we see that the application has actually failed the SLA here with all steps taking more than 60 seconds. And the difference between these two tests is simply that the test on the left has been executed in the standard way using a load generator which is local to the application, and the test on the right has used network virtualization from Shunra to replay actual network conditions of remote users. The scripts are the same, the test is the same, but the results are different. So the way that the product works is that we install onto each of the load generators Shunra network virtualization driver, and this driver allows us to specify the network conditions for the virtual users coming from the load generators. This is all controlled from the controller and the scenario. There's no script changes required whatsoever, and we can plug in network conditions, as we'll see in a minute, to replicate the remote users. Okay, so now what we are looking at is a machine where I've installed LoadRunner version 11.5.2 with the Shunra technology installed as well. And I've already configured a script, and that script actually executes a local web server of 5 steps. What we have here is the scenario. I've set up the scenario to use my script, and you can see I've got it running in a single group, and I could run that test right now. And the impact would be that I would have local users with no network conditions running entirely next to the web server. However, what I want to do is to show the capability of network virtualization. So what I'm going to do is to actually duplicate the same scenario 4 times here. And we can now see that we've got the script running 4 times. It's the same script running in 4 different groups. What we can then do is we can click on the Network Virtualization Settings dialog, which is a new dialog available in the 11.5.2 release. And this allows us to enable network virtualization. If I just click out of that, you'll see that the immediate impact is that we have a new column, which is the virtual location for each group. So what I can now do is go back into the Network Virtualization Settings, and I can define my locations, and I simply enter the names of those locations. Okay. So now what we can do is, for each of the locations, in this case we'll choose New York, I can click on Configure to fire up the network virtualization from Shunra dialog, which allows me to specify the network conditions. And we see that we have several options for inputting the conditions. The first option using custom settings is that we plug in manual settings. So I can specify 100 milliseconds of one-way latency, a specified level of packet loss, and also the upload and download bandwidth, which I may want for this test. And of course these can be different. Alternatively, I can actually use the import from library option, and what this allows me to do is dynamically access the Shunra Global Library. And the Shunra Global Library is maintained by Shunra, and it comprises a large database of millions of network conditions sourced from third parties but also from our own tools. And it allows us to collate those together to give sample network conditions for users in different parts of the world. For example, I can actually specify, in this case, the user in London and the remote server in New York. Having done that, we can then progress to the next stage, and this allows me to see the different connections which we have in our database, the different profiles of network conditions, the mobile operators that I may specify. So we could, for example, specify Vodafone, and then we can see that I can also specify a particular type of connectivity, for example 3G, and then whether it's in the office hours or outside of that. I will select the average across the whole day, and then I proceed to the next step. And we see that I can also specify poor, fair or good conditions, allowing me to choose the average, the worst conditions or the best conditions which users will see. In this case I'm going to choose fair, and I simply click on OK. And this picks up the network conditions from the global database, and I simply apply those, and I now have the conditions applied for that location. Something else that we can define is a number of options for this virtual location. In this case, we can specify the way that the bandwidth is allocated to the virtual users. So the default option is to share that specified bandwidth amongst all the users in the group in the virtual location. This would be useful for example, 20 remote users in an office in India, and they share a 10 meg line. Alternatively, if I'm testing a web or a mobile app, then each consumer, each mobile or web user will have their own unique bandwidth, and I can specify that here. And simply it takes the bandwidth settings and provides a separate bandwidth configuration for each virtual user, so they do not overlap. Okay, so having configured my locations, now what I can do is I can go back into the scenario and simply select the locations. So the first group will be the local user, the second group will be London, the third group will be, in this case, Glasgow, and the fourth group will be New York. And that's all that I need to do. There's nothing more, there's no changes to the scenario, there's no changes to the script, nothing else. Okay, so now we can execute the test. And we see that the test is starting. And now we have 4 virtual users running, 1 each in each of the groups. And each of the groups is actually running under a different network condition as we specified. You can also see that a change in the latest version is that you can actually look at Shunra metrics immediately in the running console here. So I can actually see the different ranges of network conditions by pulling across a Shunra network virtualization graph from the default list. Okay, so the test is now completed. And what we can do is use the standard analysis to have a look at the different performance of the locations. Good. And so if we look at the transaction response time, we actually see a graph here for all the different locations averaged across the steps in the journey. What we want to do is we want to reconfigure this so that we can actually see the performance per location. And the first thing to do this is actually to change the graph so that we can show a bar. And now we can see the average performance across all locations for each of the steps in the journey. And now what we can do is we can actually change the filtering and add a location name to a selected group so that we can actually see the performance based on the different locations. So this graph, having been reconfigured, now shows us each of the 5 steps in our journey and the different performance for those steps based on location. If we have a look at, for example, this step here, this is called credit report, we see that the local user took 1.8 seconds and the remote users took considerably longer, with up to 19.6 seconds, which is more than 10 times slower. If we look at, for example, the first page in the journey, this is called the bank account page, this took 0.1 seconds on the local user and up to 2.2 seconds, which is 20 times slower for the remote user. So what we've seen is that we can use the standard HP user interface to add network conditions, network virtualization. We can pull in network conditions, we can define those manually. We can use the Shunra global library. We can also use profiles of recorded network conditions from Shunra Network Catcher. And we can apply those based on user group. So we can have multiple locations per load generator, and we can visualize the results. Another important difference is that we can apply bandwidth constrictions per user, meaning that we can accurately support the performance testing of mobile and web users.